Hello, and welcome back to Trilogy Time, the series where I review movie trilogies and then give them a rating at the end. That's pretty much what it is. Recently, I watched The Batman in theaters, and since then I've been on a bit of a Batman kick, so what better trilogy to talk about than the Dark Knight trilogy? Spoilers ahead for the whole trilogy. Starting off, we have the only real live-action Batman origin story. We've seen clips of Batman's parents dying in other live-action movies, but this is the only one that is all about his origin story and nothing else. As far as superhero origin story movies go, this one is pretty good. It does a good job at really setting up the look and feel of this specific version of Batman, while also digging deep into the psychology of Bruce Wayne and explaining just why would somebody go out at night dressed up like a bat and beat up criminals. Overall, the film does a good job at giving us all of this setup while also telling a really good story themed around fear. Bruce Wayne working through his fears, Falcone using fear to control the crime world, Batman using his own fear against the criminals, and we even get the classic Batman villain who's themed all around fear. Overall, the film is paced out very well, showing Bruce Wayne slowly work up to becoming Batman, while also building up the villain's plots at the same time. Overall, a pretty good movie. The only real complaint I have with it is that the action scenes kinda suck. Like, they're all just a bunch of shaky cam, quick cut stuff where it's really hard to tell what's even going on. The only action scene I particularly like in this movie is the one where Batman is sort of sneaking around in the darkness, taking out these goons. It's dark and creepy, kind of like a horror movie, shown from the perspective of the bad guys, and showing us exactly why people are so afraid of Batman. Good stuff.
Where are you? Here.
Now it's time to get into the movie that I think really put this trilogy in the legendary status that it's in. The Dark Knight. What can I really say about this movie that hasn't already been said? This movie was an instant classic, and it's pretty easy to see why. It's paced brilliantly. It has a great crime drama aspect to it. It really tests our hero in new and interesting ways. And the action is actually good this time. And, I feel like I'm forgetting something. Yeah, I'm talking about the Joker, obviously. And yeah, I know that saying Heath Ledger has an amazing performance in this movie is like a broken record at this point, but it really can't be said enough. I feel like every time I rewatch this movie, I'm amazed by his performance yet again, despite the fact that I've seen it so many times at this point. Ledger did a great job at making the character feel kind of funny and quirky, but also terrifying at the same time. He creates an interesting and unique new challenge for Batman because he doesn't really have any specific plan or goals. His main goal is just to cause as much chaos as possible, while also trying to show that even the most upstanding, perfect, well-loved members of society can be corrupted. So he kind of wins at this goal and causes the main characters to have to live a lie in order to hide the fact that he won. That's a really interesting note to end the film on. Speaking of this ending, I really have to talk about the character of Harvey Dent, and more specifically, Harvey Dent's relationship to the character of Jim Gordon. The two do respect each other, but from the very first scene they have together, we can see that they really do butt heads a lot. Harvey doesn't really like that Gordon's men are kinda shady, but Gordon assures him that it's okay and that's what they need to get the job done. This little disagreement between the characters doesn't seem too important at first, but as the plot thickens, you start to realize that it's actually extremely important, as it becomes one of the main driving forces of the final moments of the film. Those men that Harvey didn't trust helped in directly leading to the death of Rachel. And that ultimately sends Harvey down a mad spiral, leading him to want to get revenge on Harvey, which leads us directly to this final scene. I find it interesting that the final confrontation of this movie doesn't really even involve the Joker, and yet it's still really good, showing us that Heath Ledger's amazing performance isn't the only thing that made this movie so great. It's just one small part in a greater whole that is one very well-crafted narrative that's enthralling from start to finish. There's no doubt in my mind that this movie is up there on the list of greatest sequels of all time. Okay, so I don't really like this movie that much. The main issue with The Dark Knight Rises, to me, is a lack of focus. I think there's some interesting ideas here. I just don't think any of them really come together in an interesting or cohesive way. Like, I'm not even really sure what the main theme of the movie is, which is strange coming from a series that's all about strong themes and deeper meanings. The first movie has a very clear theme of fear and carries that theme very well throughout the movie and explores it very well. The second movie is about chaos versus order and brilliantly explores all aspects of this theme. This film, I guess, is also kind of about fear, but also about Batman realizing his limits and about rising up against evil or something like that. It's kind of hard to say because I think a lot of these ideas were definitely brought up, but I just don't think were explored in any real interesting way. It also seems weird that they really try to go back to the whole theme of fear because the first movie already did a really good job at covering that. In fact, this movie actually seems to try to retread a lot of what the first movie does for some reason. The villain is literally just a prodigy of the first movie's villain with the same exact goals and motivations. I get that they tried to do this to make the movies feel more connected and really bring it full circle, but that kind of seems weird to just suddenly do with the third movie when the second movie didn't really try to do that at all. There's also just some really weird things in this movie that just really annoy me. Like, how does Blake figure out who Batman is because Bruce Wayne looked at him in a certain way years ago when he was a kid? Oh, and while we're on the character of Blake, why does this movie try to tell me that he's Robin at the end? This isn't Robin. He's just a young cop who likes to do the right thing, even when it's hard. And that's pretty much his character. Even the movie knows he's a pointless character, as he really doesn't have anything that important to do in the climax. The entire climax, he's just trying to get this bus full of kids out of the city before the bomb blows up. But at the end of the day, the bomb ends up getting taken far away, and the city doesn't get blown up anyways, so it just kind of feels like all he did was pointless. So at the end of the day, I just have to ask, why even include this character? I feel like he had potential to be something interesting, but just didn't have anything interesting going on, so he just was there for no reason. And he's not Robin. Okay, after that rant, I'm going to go into discussing the main villain. Bane is pretty cool, despite the fact that he doesn't resemble the character of Bane in any way, shape, or form. He's still pretty cool in this movie. It's kind of nice to see Batman face a villain who's physically stronger and better in a fight than he is. It creates a new challenge for Batman that we haven't really seen so far in this series. It's also kind of cool that Batman has to think differently when he fights him a second time. Instead of trying to beat him with pure strength like he did before, he decides to target a very specific weak point. So yeah, overall, Bane is a decent villain. Too bad he's not the main villain for some reason. So closer to the end of the movie, we find out that it was actually some other character who was behind everything and not Bane, despite the fact that it's not really set up very well, and it really doesn't change the story that much, so it makes you ask the question, Why? Like, it's literally just a twist for the sake of having a twist. Bane worked just fine as the main villain. Why undo that? Why change it? Okay, so there are some things I like about this movie. I think the whole section where Bane just kind of holds the city hostage and it becomes this sort of dystopian city is kind of cool. And the whole thing with Scarecrow being the judge in these messed up trials was a really fun idea.
Now, what will it be? Death or exile?
I actually really enjoy this character, and it was cool that he made an appearance in each of the movies. Okay, so this whole section of the movie is kind of interesting and all, but it ultimately culminates in a really boring climax. It's just a big battle where they have to stop a bomb in time. This type of climax can work in some movies, but it just doesn't feel right in this series, and overall just isn't done well. When I got to the climax, I was honestly just kind of bored and ready for the movie to be over. There's just nothing going on in the climax to really make it interesting. It's just kind of disappointing when I know that this series can have much more interesting climaxes, especially in The Dark Knight. Overall, The Dark Knight Rises isn't that bad of a movie, but it's just extremely disappointing when compared to the first two. In conclusion, I really only think that this trilogy is as legendary as it is because of the second movie and a little bit because of the first. The first film is a great starting point, and the second is a really good sequel that does a good job at taking a lot of the ideas and setup of the first and expanding it in new and interesting ways. This causes it to be a rare example of a sequel that's better than the original. Unfortunately, that momentum isn't fully carried into the final film, so it makes the entire trilogy suffer as a result. I put a lot of thought into this, and I've decided that I'm gonna have to give the Dark Knight trilogy a trilogy rating of a 3 out of 5. I was close to going with a 4 out of 5, but The Dark Knight Rises just brings it down too much for me. It was to the point where I'm not even sure if I'll ever have an interest in watching it ever again. From now on, when I watch this series, I'll probably only watch the first two. So now I just have to add it to my trilogy ranking list, which, as you can see, is pretty easy right now because there's only 2 trilogies on the list so far. Anyways, please let me know what you think of this trilogy in the comments. I would love to hear your opinions, especially if they differ from mine. Like, if you really like The Dark Knight Rises, please let me know why. I'd be interested to hear your opinions. Yeah, also check out the Waban podcast. That's a podcast I have with a friend of mine where we talk about movies and TV shows, and we actually have an episode of that podcast talking about The Dark Knight. So if you want to hear more detailed thoughts of mine on that movie, definitely check that episode of the podcast out. Yeah, and check out others if you're interested. So yeah, thank you all for watching. Goodbye, everyone.